Hi, my name is Coleman O'Mara. I'm going to do a presentation on Michael Palmer's poem titled I Do Not. The way I'm going to structure my presentation is as follows. I'm going to begin with a brief biographical sketch on the poet. I'm then going to spend almost all of the presentation talking about the poem's themes and meanings, while also analyzing some of the formal qualities or literary devices that Palmer uses in order to help to shape or emphasize the meaning. So, as I said, I'm going to begin with a brief biographical sketch. Palmer is an American poet and translator. He was born in 1943 in New York. Studied at Harvard, where he got his Bachelor of Arts in French and then a master's degree in comparative literature. He then moved to San Francisco after his graduation and worked in contemporary dance for 30 years. He is a language poet, and language does play a really important role in the poem I Do Not, which is what I'm analyzing today. What I asked myself is, what exactly is that role? So first I looked at language as an instrument of control or power, which seems to be pretty evident on first reading of the poem. The narrator struggles to communicate or can't communicate at all, and therefore feels powerless because he doesn't speak English. And he gives countless examples of this. He says he can't ask for food because all he can do is make incoherent gestures which can be mistaken for something else. He can't be intimate with a woman simply because he can't ask her for permission. He can't share his past experiences in his life, and as a result can't define himself. And because of this, he feels a loss of identity. And the narrator or speaker would argue that that these linguistic hierarchies, where basically English is the most important language, and whatever language he speaks is simply not relevant in this setting, which we assume is America, that these linguistic hierarchies disenfranchise and exclude the narrator, and therefore act as an instrument of control and of power, and he is simply not empowered as a result of his lack of knowledge of English. But I think language also plays a different role in this poem. I think it's the subject of the poem to some extent, as it is the subject of all language poetry. And the first way this came to my attention was the language being used as symbols, or in a symbolic sense. The symbol of the mouth and the tongue is consistently repeated throughout, or different parts of the mouth is consistently repeated throughout the poem. When the narrator is explaining that he can't ask for food, he says all he can do is point to his mouth. He wishes he could ask a woman permission to kiss her on her lips. And then later there's a really, I think, some really vivid imagery created when he talks about a ship of stone whose sail was a tongue. This is an interesting symbol for a couple of reasons. I mean, mainly it's a comparison to humans. The narrator is basically suggesting that all humans are ships of stone, which, as we can understand, are pretty useless. They would sink. But most ships of stone have a sail of a tongue, which empowers them to sail or to communicate. The narrator himself, of course, has no sail because he's unable to communicate. He doesn't have the tongue which he can use to speak English. So if we do assume that language is the subject of this poem, then we must also assume that Palmer, as a language poet, doesn't believe in meaning separate from language. He doesn't believe in meaning outside of language. He thinks that meaning can only be created by language. And I struggle to accept that. There's one stanza in particular that makes me skeptical, which I'm going to quote from, and it's no way to speak of my past or hopes for the future, of my glasses mysteriously shattered in Rotterdam, the statue of Eros and Psyche in the summer garden, the sudden shrill cries in the streets of Sao Paulo, a watch abruptly stopping in Paris. This paragraph's really interesting because it's how he defines his past, how he shares his past experiences, and he complains that he's unable to do this without the knowledge of English. What's interesting about it is that his past experiences, none of them are at all defined by language. Nothing is a conversation. Nothing has to do with any other people or communication at all. It's just little things that happen to him in places around the world, and he wishes he could share these experiences, but none of the experiences are defined by language, yet these seem to be the most important to him. What also makes me skeptical about language as the pure subject of this poem, and thereby the poem as a pure language poem, is Palmer's experience in contemporary dance. Contemporary dance is a way to express and share emotions and thereby communicate in a nonverbal and non-written way. Since he has this extensive experience in that field, I'm sure he's aware of communication techniques outside of written or spoken word. And in fact, he does argue that he's not a language poet. He insists that he's not a language poet in various interviews. And the question is, why does he do this? And perhaps it's to direct a focus towards the political. There are obviously political messages in this poem. In order to dive into those a little more, I'm going to talk about the role of the speaker. In language poetry, the speaker is typically assumed to be much less important than the meaning. In fact, he's only there to convey the meaning. And I think that's not entirely the case here, although we do have a disembodied I, never really defined as anything other than that simple pronoun. I find that there is character development throughout the poem. At first, the sentence structure is really awkward. In fact, the repeated phrase, "I do not know English," that phrase by itself is awkward. I think most people would assume, or would phrase it as, "I do not speak English." But then throughout the poem, the speaker becomes more and more able to communicate well in English. He's soon playing around with some really whimsical language. He's making not so much plays on words as kind of tongue twisters in the stanza that goes, "Nor can I utter the words science, séance, silence, language, and languish." Some of these words are words that aren't familiar even to native speakers of English, and there are other examples of this throughout the poem as well. This shows more than anything that the narrator is really well educated. He backs this up with references to the Italian novelist Umberto Eco in the line about roses, and he shows that he's very knowledgeable about scripture as well. So again, he's showing that he's well read and well educated and held back only by his crippling inability to communicate in English. And I think we have to assume that Palmer's taking some creative license here. Of course, Palmer's native language is English, born and lived in the US all his life. So he writes his poetry in English, but we're assuming that he translates the speaker's thoughts from another language to English. And that makes me wonder a little more about the speaker's identity. He's obviously shown great dexterity with language, but I don't think that means we can assume that the speaker is simply an extension of the poet. I think the speaker he has the role of kind of directing us and directing our emotions. Palmer uses the speaker as a tool to direct our emotions as we read the poem. And I think the main emotion here is kind of that of alienation and displacement, which the speaker feels throughout the poem. And I think some of these allusions, especially in the latter parts of the poem, are designed to make us feel similarly out of place as the speaker does in his experience in a foreign country, I'm assuming in the United States. So, for example, the allusion to Umberto Eco, that was something I had to research. That was not something that I understood right away, and there were several others in here that I just didn't understand right away, and I think the poem's designed in that way to make us feel a little out of place and a little uncertain when faced with language that we're not familiar with. But then the speaker is able to turn it right back around. He references seeing a muscular man waving a stick at a ball. This must have seemed absurd to the speaker, but to us it's very obviously baseball. And I think the use of baseball is clever here because baseball is seen as the quintessentially American pastime. Like, it's a real American symbol. And the fact that it's so foreign to the speaker in this poem is just another great example of how such a well-educated, well-read person can feel completely out of their depth when they're in a new situation and when they don't have the language to quickly adapt to that situation. I think one of the formal devices that Palmer uses in order to basically use the speaker effectively in this poem is repeated negation. Obviously, the poem lives off repetition. The line, "I do not know English," is repeated over and over again. But even after that, there's kind of a secondary clause in each stanza, which is always, "I do not know English, and therefore I cannot do this, and therefore I cannot do that." And this negation, on the one hand, it gives the speaker a kind of pathetic quality, but I think more than that, it gives us a yearning to help him to do these things. It makes us feel some sympathy or pity for him. And I think in this way it makes the speaker a real character, more so than other speakers in other language poetry are. And I think by guiding our response towards the speaker and towards his message, Palmer has made the speaker a true character and has removed, first of all, has given him an identity, but also has removed the poem a little bit from the realm of pure language poetry. By doing this, he's also emphasized some of the political aspects of the poem. It's clear that he's speaking about a hierarchy of languages whereby English is the dominant and all other languages are not as dominant. It seems that the narrator or the speaker is a real citizen of the world. He's clearly the experiences of the stanza that I quoted before take place in 4 different countries: in the Netherlands, in Russia, in France, and in Portugal, I believe. No, sorry, in Brazil, where Portuguese is spoken. That's right. And yeah, he's clearly well experienced and well educated, but English is seen as superior to these languages because his ability to succeed in these 4 different contexts are completely useless to him in this new realm. And I think Palmer, simply by writing this poem and by expressing it the way he has, is critical of this, and that's one of the maybe this is a critique of globalization or of kind of the neoliberal construct that leads to globalization on Palmer's part. He also makes some smaller allusions in the poem, which also I think play or can be seen in a political sense. Near the end of the poem, he references different names that the narrator has been called simply for his inability to speak English. One of these names is a truly lost boy, and this was reminiscent to me of the term "the lost boys," which is how Sudanese or young Sudanese refugees are often referred to, who have been displaced in the conflict in Darfur. And I think this allusion to displaced cultures is really important, especially in comparison to the United States. There's a reference to war at the very beginning. Where the narrator shares that he can't share his opinion on wars, and then once again at the end of the poem, the war is declared ended almost before it has begun. It just shows that war, as terrible as it is really trivialized in the United States simply because of the fact that it's not local. It rarely really affects the population in a significant way, which is very much unlike the other cultures that he's referred to, especially, for example, Sudan. And this juxtaposition, I think, is really important in creating a dichotomy between English and the languages that are spoken elsewhere. I think another way he really is able to unify his message is structural repetition. He's created a structure in the poem where he begins a clause with "I do not know English," and then gives a secondary counterpoint. And simply by always having the same beginning to the clause, "I do not know English," the second or the subclause in that sentence, those subclauses, I as the reader always connect them with each other simply because the primary clauses are the same. And by connecting them with each other as experiences that the narrator is having, negative experiences that he's having because he does not know English, for me that really unifies the message of the speaker and of Palmer, which is basically that language as a tool of power is really restrictive, especially to immigrants or to people who do not speak the language. And yeah, I thought this was an interesting form of repetition, which I don't always pay attention to when I'm analyzing poems, but I thought it was really effective in this sense because it was able to unify the message a little by drawing my attention to the fact that these secondary clauses are all related to each other. So yeah, in conclusion, I've analyzed Michael Palmer's poem, I Do Not. I found that language is definitely a central theme to the poem, as it is an example of language poetry. And I investigated a little bit whether language is used primarily as an instrument of control or power, or rather as the subject of the poem. Further, I looked at the role of the speaker and at his identity, and what that means for the poem, and also at how Palmer shares some of his political views in the poem. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.